Welcome to this week's Episode of Insight. During this week's show, we're going to cover three items: controversies around the very frequent blackouts that we've had in Yerevan this year, electricity blackouts. Then we're going to move on to the release of former Armenian Minister of Defense Davit Tonoyan from prison. And then we're going to close with some comments about the soon-to-be released report on the 2020 war from Parliament. Speaking about the very common blackouts we've had in Yerevan this summer, this has triggered a war of words between consumer groups, citizens groups, and the electric company ENA that owns the system. ENA claims that they have spent over $200 million upgrading the grid, and they're going to spend another $600 million upgrading the grid, which is mostly a legacy system from the 1960s. And they blame the frequent electricity cutoffs in Yerevan to the massive amount of construction that's going on. We all know that actually most of Yerevan looks like a construction site. I'm not sure how much that has to do with disrupting electricity services. The reality is that there's a couple of things at play here. There's a direct correlation, and has been anywhere in the world, between economic growth and higher energy use. So obviously our grids are being tested, and energy consumption is going up because you have economic growth. They always go together. And obviously we've had growth, consistent and actually significant growth, for a couple of years. So obviously the system is going to be tested. To the extent of upgrading this grid, I'm not sure how much you can actually upgrade a 60-year-old system. The reality is that we actually need a brand new grid, or a secondary grid, and that's estimated to cost somewhere between $800 million to $1 billion. And the reason you need it is all traditional legacy grid systems are designed to take electricity from 2 or 3 sources: a dam, a nuclear power plant, while all the modern ones that are being built over the last 10, 15 years are designed to take electricity from 10, 15,000 renewables locations, solar panels, wind farms. And so they need to be far more flexible in doing that, and ours is not set up for that. And in fact, not having a new grid is actually delaying us making the transition to solar, which we should, given the fact that it means energy independence and actually national security, and allow us to get away from fossil fuels as fast as possible. About 2 weeks ago, it was reported that former wartime Defense Minister Davit Tonoyan was released from custody on 15 million drums bail. He was released from jail. Davit Tonoyan has been charged in a criminal case involving abuses in the supply of ammunition. Implicated also are David Galastian, the head of the company supplying weapons to Armenia, and Stefan Galastian, the former deputy chief of the general staff of the armed forces. What are we to make of this release and the charges against him? Obviously, we have no way of knowing if the charges against Mr. Toyan are real or not. We're not prosecutors or judges. But let's, for the sake of argument, accept that these charges are all true and that he is guilty, which leads us to the obvious question: where are all the other charges against people in the armed forces? We know that for a good part of the last 30 years, a good part of the Ministry of Defense has been a den of thieves. This is not a secret to anyone living in Armenia. We have all heard stories from generals that have a monopoly on crayfish production, all the way to military figures that own restaurants that are supplied by food that used to be stolen from our soldiers. In fact, we know that there's documented that there are 2 former defense ministers who own homes, one of $1 million, multi-million-dollar homes in Armenia and abroad, when obviously their salaries could not enable them to do that. In principle, I have nothing against prosecuting Mr. Tonoyan if he's actually guilty during his service of any of these crimes, as long as everyone else who's responsible is prosecuted with him. What's interesting is during one of his pretrial hearings, what Mr. Tonoyan said is, I know that in truth I'm being arrested not for the reasons they claim, but for losing the war. And in reality, there must be some truth to that, the way we know politics works. What we need to have is, again, a justice system that applies equally and not politically, because short of that, what we have is not justice, but in fact vengeance. But before we move on to this from this section, I just want to make clear that despite the corruptions that we all know was the military, at the same time there were many, many people, if not most people, who were honest and did their job honorably, and obviously my comments do not reflect on that. Continuing on the same theme, we're going to focus on the parliamentary report that is slated to come out in a few weeks, which is the review of the 2020 war. This is the parliamentary committee that's headed by a member of parliament named Andranik Kocharian, who's actually the chair of the committee. A few observations with this. First of all, the amount of time that this has taken is ridiculous. It's almost 4 years. In most democratic countries, these kinds of reports are produced in 6 months, and soon after that, reforms start. We will obviously judge the report when it comes out. We don't know what's in it at this point. In reality, unlike other places, as I said, you have a report, then you have reforms. Serious reforms in our military really didn't start until after the September 22 invasion of Armenia itself. Now, we know that many of the generals from the 2020 war have been sidelined and replaced by younger officers. But just as an example, I want everyone to watch the following video.
Israel's military intelligence chief has stood down after saying that he takes full responsibility for the lapse in security on October the 7th. Let's get more on this breaking news story with Bernard Smith. He's in occupied East Jerusalem. So militarily, the heads have started to roll.
Yes, Aaron Haliva is the head of military intelligence, decades of experience, and was in charge on October 7th when Hamas launched that assault into Israel, the most devastating assault that Israel has happened in Israel since the country's foundation in 1948. Now, we now know that since then, the reason that was allowed to happen was largely because of a spectacular failure of military intelligence. We now know that for up to a year before the Hamas attack on October the 7th, the Israeli intelligence had had hands on a document that pretty much detailed how October the 7th would pan out. We know that spotters, Israeli military spotters in the towers around Gaza have been reporting for months that they'd seen activity in Gaza that looked like Hamas and other fighting groups were rehearsing, preparing for some sort of attack on Israel. All of that was ignored.
Here you have the head of Israeli military intelligence doing the honorable thing and actually quitting for his failures, a failure that led to the death of a couple of hundred of his troops and nearly 1,000 civilians. Yet, in our case, there's actually only one case of a single high-ranking person that actually resigned for their failures and took responsibility. And interestingly enough, that's actually Davit Tonoyan, the former defense minister that I just outlined. And you might ask, why is the case? In fact, we should all ask, why is the case? And I think the answer to that is actually cultural in nature, because you either have a cultural blame or you have a culture of responsibility. And ours is a culture of blame. A cultural blame, obviously, is not capable of reforming things, actually moving things in the right direction. Not to say that there isn't blame, but that cannot be the end all of all things. The question is to come up with solutions. But you know that we, as ordinary citizens, we're not off the hook. The biggest indictment is the lack of public anger in demanding accountability and actions for these failures. If we are not willing to demand accountability for the 4,000 mostly young men who this war put in their early graves, we deserve everything that happened to us. Do you know what is the primary difference between a first and a third world country? It actually isn't economic development, it's not infrastructure, it's not per capita income. The primary difference is, the biggest difference is, do you have a demand for responsibility culture or do you not? In which responsibility is demanded and expected from the lowest to the highest person in that country. Thank you for joining me in these 6 episodes of Insights.
Sir, you're out of order. Out of order? I show you out of order. You don't know what out of order is, Mr. Trask. I'd show you, but I'm too old. I'm too tired. I'm too fucking blind. If I were the man I was 5 years ago, I'd take a flamethrower to this place. Out of order. Who the hell do you think you're talking to? I've been around, you know. There was a time I could see, and I have seen, boys like these, younger than these, their arms torn out, their legs ripped off. But there is nothing like the sight of an amputated spirit. There is no prosthetic for that.